All right, just like we talked about with testosterone receptors, I think we talked about that. Estrogen receptors, since estrogen is a steroid, the receptors for the estrogen um, hormone are going to be inside of the nucleus. That's why we call them nuclear receptors, because they're inside the nucleus. What they do is they bind to estrogen response elements, which are transcription elements that will force the transcription of new genes. The mRNA that's produced will then dictate the production of proteins, and then you will get new proteins uh, being made. Some of those are different types of receptors, nitric oxide synthase, things like that. In spite of that, estrogen also has a membrane receptor. It's a G protein coupled receptor, so it relies on second messengers to get into the cell. And what these do is instead of having genomic effects, in other words, instead of directing the synthesis of new proteins, these will have more acute effects on the cells, such as an increase in intracellular calcium, stimulating nitric oxide synthesis to produce nitric oxide to cause vasodilation when needed. Uh, Also will inhibit the proliferation of certain cells when needed, and it will upregulate the synthesis of estrogen receptor as well as progesterone receptor, and can also act as a weak antioxidant. So, um, normally you always hear estrogen has an intracellular receptor. It's nuclear. It causes gene transcription and translation, but there are some non-genomic effects here, and these are what's listed. All right, so estrogen or estradiol is what's responsible for the development of secondary female sexual characteristics. And just like males, those are something you're probably already familiar with. So the growth and proliferation of sex organs, or cell proliferation leading to the growth of sex organs. The vaginal epithelium changes prepubescent from cuboidal, which is not a very protective thing, to stratified squamous epithelium, which is a protective layer because now you're getting ready, you're producing a thicker walled vagina to prepare for all that's needed to have to reproduce. The uterus will increase in size up to a point. You know, after you get pregnant, then of course it increases beyond that. But we're talking about the basal size. This is when the uterine tubes will become ciliated. So pre-puberty, the uterine tubes are not ciliated. They become ciliated after puberty. And if you think about it, it will take time because that will involve a change of what the cells do and a slight change in type. So that's going to take time. So you start puberty right away. That doesn't necessarily mean you can get pregnant right away because all of these things take time to develop to their mature state. Breasts, of course, will start to increase because you have more connective tissue, a ductal system for milk, and fat deposition. Uh, you'll have decreased osteoclastic activity, and I'm sorry these didn't come out. That's supposed to say, you guys have the PowerPoint. It's supposed to be decreased osteoclast activity, so you're not breaking down bone as much. So estrogen has a protective factor against bone breakdown, which is why after menopause, when estrogen decreases, bone mass decreases, and you run the risk of osteoporosis. All right. You have a slight increase in proteins, but not as much as you would have as male because estrogen effects are not as strong as testosterone. Slight increase in metabolism, but you're going to gain more subcutaneous fat in the spots you need it for reproductive purposes. Very little impact on hair. Skin gets more smooth, it's vascular. You also develop hair like males do, but not as abundant and only in certain places relative to males. And then you have a slight increase in sodium and water retention. But again, not as much as males because males have a larger muscle mass, therefore they're going to retain more water because of that large muscle mass. Since females have a larger fat mass relative to males, fat does not allow you to hold on to water, so water retention is not going to be as pronounced. All right, it turns out that progesterone has some effects on secondary sexual characteristics as well. It will help with secretory changes in the endometrium, and we saw that during the cycles that we went over previously. Progesterone helps the uterus to contract. It helps secretion in the mucosal lining to provide nutrients for the oocyte as it's traveling along. And progesterone will also help develop the lobules and alveoli within the breast to give you the capacity to produce milk. All right, so females have a lifetime reproductive cycle as well as a monthly reproductive cycle. Starts at puberty. You have the first period, which is called, or the first menstrual cycle, which is called menarche, and then you have menopause, where all of this dies down. So, of course, we know what puberty is. It's the onset of your adult sexual life, where you start becoming sexually mature and able to reproduce. Usually, this is gradual. Gonadotropin releasing hormone can start as early as 8 years old. And in fact, my daughter probably started even earlier than that, because she started developing hair in her pubic region when she was about 7. And we took her to an endocrinologist, and they did all kinds of tests on her, and it turns out that she was fine. There's not going to be any deleterious effects because of this, but it gets you worried that is my daughter going to go through this early? Is she not going to be as tall as other people? Is this going to cause problems with her growth patterns? Things like that. But typically, even though it starts in the 8th year, puberty onset's about 11 to 16 years. So, like I said, it takes a long time for this process to occur, and it takes a long time for those cellular changes to take place. Puberty is marked by the onset of your first menstrual cycle, and that is called menarche. That happens at about 13 years of age. That is when you fully realize that you have become sexually mature and you're ready to reproduce. Even though that is around 13 years old, it has occurred before 11 as well. Sometimes as early as 9 or 10. And then, of course, menopause. Menopause usually happens in 40s or 50s. Average is about 51.4 years. Obviously, there's a wide range of this. What happens is menstrual cycles start becoming irregular. The ovaries aren't working like they once did, and one of the theories is that it's from the buildup of scar tissue, those leftover follicles that didn't develop, and the involution of the corpus luteum into the corpus albicans. And so what that does is it produces low estrogen, low progesterone, but you're going to have an increase in gonadotropins. And the reason for that is your gonadotropins are like, hey, there's no estrogen here to shut me down, so I'm just going to start trying to cause the release of more estrogen. But it doesn't work, of course, because there is a physiological reason why you're not producing estrogen anymore, but your anterior pituitary doesn't know any better, so it's going to increase the production to try to stimulate more estrogen and progesterone. And of course, the symptoms of menopause, we all hear about the hot flashes, the shortness of breath, the irritability, being tired all the time, anxiety, decrease in bone strength and calcification, potentially leading to osteoporosis, which is one of the reasons why it's important for a female to stay very active up until the time that they are going through menopause, so they build up and maintain bone strength, so that when they start decreasing bone strength due to menopause, or bone mass due to menopause, that you don't develop osteoporosis as quickly. All right, just like males with low testosterone function, if you have low ovarian function in females, hypo ovarian function, that can lead to eunuchism, where you don't have ovaries at birth, and you basically have infantile sex characteristics. You don't look like a fully mature woman. You look more like, even though you're tall, you might be tall as a normal adult woman. You look more like a child. You have the appearance more of a child than you do of an adult woman. And you tend to be taller as well because estrogen has a pronounced effect on the closure of the epiphyseal plate. So if you don't have that estrogen, the epiphyseal plates don't close as quickly. Therefore, women with hypo-ovarian function tend to be a little bit taller. Hypofunction can also cause you to have either irregular or no menses. And then there's hyperfunction. Hyperfunction, too much ovarian function, too much steroids. You can have, those usually come from like a feminizing tumor. They secrete large amounts of estrogen and will basically exacerbate all the secondary sexual characteristics of a female. Some terms that you need to be familiar with, and you probably saw these on your, some of these on your medical terminology exam. Be familiar with what these terms are and what they mean. And these are going to be important when you get to women's health as well. So I'm not just having you do busy work. All right, just like males, females undergo erection, lubrication, and orgasm during the sexual process because the structures are very similar as we have gone over. So sexual stimulation, again, that could be thinking about something that arouses you, or seeing something that arouses you, or hearing something that arouses you, or physical contact. That will cause a release, again, like males, parasympathetic impulses, causing nitric oxide to be released, opening up arteries leading into the erectile tissues of the clitoris, causing them to swell. The vagina will also expand and elongate, and again, the purpose of that is so that it can fit the penis when it gets put in there. Also, as it becomes engorged, it will also increase the friction from the movement of the penis, which is that tactile stimulation that you need in order for the male to have an ejaculation. So as sexual stimulation intensifies, those vestibular glands will secrete mucus to lubricate, and they'll secrete more mucus to lubricate. And at the end, you end up with an orgasm, which by scientific definition is the rhythmic contraction of muscles of the perineum and the muscular walls of the uterus and uterine tubes. And the thought behind the female orgasm is to help to convey the sperm and the semen up into the female reproductive tract so they can fertilize the oocyte. All right, so let's pretend we actually did get pregnant. So now we'll talk about the process of fertilization and the development of the embryo, and touch slightly on the birthing process. Okay, so we know the oocytes released here from the ovary, and then it's going to travel up into the infundibulum, where the fimbriae are, of the uterine tube. And it's typically right here, just after where the fimbriae are, where the oocyte gets fertilized by the sperm. Okay, so it's typically right here where that occurs. And then as it's traveling down the uterine tube by those cilia, it's going to be dividing. Here's your zygote, fertilized egg. Here's 2 cells. Here's 4 cells. Here's 8 cells, and so on. It's real funny. I just noticed that these sperm I put in here are swimming out of the uterus when I put them in there. And if you look on your notes, they should be swimming up the uterus. So no, they're not running from anything. I didn't change this. It's not a mistake. These are supposed to be going this way. Sorry about that. And so about midway in the uterus, the ball of cells, which is now a blastocyst, which is a hollow ball of cells, will implant in the uterus, and we'll talk about what that is and why it's important and what it does to facilitate the development of an embryo. All right, when an oocyte is released during ovulation, what's released is this oocyte with a layer of cells that are surrounding it and some connective tissue. When the sperms start to come into play, they have to work their way through that corona radiata, and by doing that, the corona radiata starts dispersing. And then, due to factors that we talked about with the sperm, one sperm will enter the oocyte, so the acrosome will cause it to be able to weaken the cell membrane. It'll burrow in there. It will also produce changes in the cell membrane of the oocyte to prevent other sperm from getting in. And there's a picture and a video of this process. If I can find them, I will post them on Canvas for you. Of one of a sperm cell that's actually stuck in the cell membrane of the oocyte, not able to go any further, and of course that's where it's going to die. And a video that shows you how this process happens. And as the sperm gets in, remember the entire sperm gets in. The cell membrane of the sperm breaks apart, and you have what's called the male pronucleus. So the cell membrane becomes like a nuclear membrane. That will combine with the female pronucleus, combining the chromosomes, and that is what we call a fertilized ovum or a zygote. Again, once fertilized, that zygote will travel down because of fluid, because of cilia, because of some uterine tube contractions, and it'll go towards the uterus. From the time it's fertilized to the time it travels down the uterine tube, which, look at the anatomy table. When you do the dissection of Victoria, and look how actually kind of short that uterine tube is. And then think about the fact that it takes 3 to 5 days for that cilia to move the blastocyst, the zygote, the fertilized egg, down the uterine tube into the uterus. 3 to 5 days for that short distance. So it's not moving very fast. And the reason for that is it has to be divided to a certain point when it hits the uterus. And because these cells are dividing very quickly, you need a source of nutrients that's coming from the uterine tube. So it needs to go very slowly in order for things to happen properly. And then the uterus does what we call implantation. All right, and it implants due to the fact that these trophoblastic cells kind of send roots into the endometrial wall and take hold, planting the uterus, or I'm sorry, the the blastocyst where it is. All right, so this is what implantation looks like in this picture right here. So you see here's the oocyte, or God, I keep calling it an oocyte. The blastocyst that's implanted in the wall of the uterus. So this is all the endometrial layer. And here you see the glandular part of it. Here you see a blood vessel. And then here would be trophoblast cells that are eventually going to, let me use a different color, extend out and be on the search for nutrients, which will eventually become the placenta. And then the endometrium actually envelops the entire blastocyst, kind of like it's buried, like under the soil, and then it will further develop into an embryo. So this implantation occurs about 1 to 3 days after entry into the uterus. So this takes quite a while. All of this takes quite a while to happen. All right, so here's a better idea of what implantation looks like. So here we have entering the uterus. It's going to sit on top of the cells. It's going to start invading the endometrial lining with these trophoblastic cells. And if you look, they look almost like roots from a tree or roots from a plant, going in search of nutrients. and so it will slowly bury itself within the endometrium. And then when it finds blood vessels, it will release all kinds of uh, enzymes and other factors that will basically um, open blood vessels and create like a pool of blood from these blood vessels. And that will be the nutrient source for the trophoblast. And over time, those trophoblasts will develop into these chorionic villi, which contain blood vessels in them, like capillary blood vessels in them, that will eventually all coalesce into one, uh, actually, three structures: two umbilical arteries and one umbilical vein. And this is what each one of those chorionic villi would look like. So here's the pool of blood. So all of this red and the blue here would be the pool of blood that the trophoblast originally uh, delved into. And then those trophoblastic cells will continue to differentiate, become these villi. And you notice the villi has a single layer of cells between the maternal blood pool and the capillaries of the villi, so that when nutrients and oxygen and waste are exchanged, they exchange across this membrane of the chorionic villi before they actually get to the capillaries of the chorionic villi. So what that does is it helps keep bad things out of the fetal circulation and very tightly regulates what goes in and what goes out. So remember, it's progesterone that prepares the uterine lining for implantation because it makes things more vascular and more glandular. And where do all your nutrients typically come from? Vascularization. So initially, those trophoblasts will draw nutrients from surrounding cells within the endometrial wall. And then eventually, as you hit into blood vessels and you create those pools, then the amount of nutrients increases by a lot, and that's why you see diffusion across the placental membrane occur much more quickly from that point where the trophoblast implanted to where you now have a fully functioning placenta until the baby is born, parturition. All right, gas exchange into the fetal circulation happens by simple diffusion down concentration gradients. So that maternal blood pool, the maternal sinus, the partial pressure of oxygen is 50 millimeters of mercury versus 104 millimeters of mercury. So there's a lower actual pressure of oxygen. The placental oxygen is about 30 millimeters of mercury, which is lower than the 40 typically in a human, an adult human, or a born human. So the developing embryo has to find a way to capture more oxygen. So it does that in three ways. One, there is a leftward shift in fetal hemoglobin curve. What that means is that fetal hemoglobin holds on to oxygen much more tightly than adult hemoglobin does. All right. And fetal hemoglobin is increased by 50% over that of adult hemoglobin. And due to the amount of CO2 produced and therefore a decrease in pH, that will also help shift the curve to the left. All right, so giving baby a natural way to get more oxygen in low oxygen conditions. As far as other nutrients and waste, glucose, the primary fuel, will go across by facilitated diffusion through GLUT1 receptors. But keep in mind that fetal glucose is less than maternal glucose simply because the concentration. And waste goes across by diffusion. We're talking urea, uric acid, creatinine will leave into maternal circulation to be gotten rid of. All right, when the embryo implants, the trophoblastic cells that will become the placenta begin secreting human chorionic gonadotropin. And as the placenta gets bigger, the amount of HCG will also increase. And that's why you see over pregnancy this huge spike in human chorionic gonadotropin. And part of the function of human chorionic gonadotropin is to maintain the corpus luteum so that it doesn't involute for about the first trimester. And then after the first trimester, the placenta then begins taking over the production of estrogen and progesterone. And so as that placenta gets bigger, it's going to secrete more progesterone and more estrogen up until estrogen eventually becomes a more dominant steroid hormone compared to progesterone. And when the ratio of estrogen to progesterone reaches a certain level, that is actually thought to be the trigger for parturition. All right, so everything on this slide is basically the same thing that I said on the previous slide, only it gives you some more specific numbers associated with that. All right, some of the purposes of these steroid hormones coming from the fetus is to enlarge the uterus, make it bigger, make it able to fit the growing embryo and fetus, increase the size of the breast and the breast ducts in order for milk production to eventually get to the point where it needs to by the time parturition occurs, and enlarging the external genitalia as well to prepare for birthing a child through those canals which aren't big enough to birth a child. It also relaxes pelvic joints, both the sacroiliac joints in the back and the symphysis pubis in the front. And it also stimulates LDL cholesterol uptake, which will allow you to make more estrogen and progesterone, which is needed for the pregnancy process. Oops, I guess that previous slide was all estrogen. This is the effects of progesterone. All right, so progesterone will promote the development of the decidual cells, which is basically the endometrial lining, to help promote the development of the embryo and fetus. Progesterone will also reduce the contractility of the uterus, and because you don't want the uterus contracting spontaneously and pushing the baby out before its time. So what this does is it prevents spontaneous abortion. So what that means is that if progesterone is low, that will increase the risk of spontaneous abortion. So important to remember, important to keep track of progesterone if you suspect a high-risk pregnancy. All right, it helps out with the secretions as that ball of cells is moving down the uterine tubes. And it also helps prepare the breast for lactation. All right, so major hormones during pregnancy. HCG, also called human chorionic somatomamotropin, that can be detectable as early as the 5th week of pregnancy. And like we said, that amount of that increases in proportion to placental size. So as the placenta increases, so does the amount of HCG. And we showed the graphs for that earlier. All right. Other possible functions include breast development, weak growth effects, and decreased maternal insulin sensitivity, so that there's more glucose available for the fetus to take because it's going to need energy because those cells are dividing very rapidly. From the pituitary gland, you have adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to cause the release of adrenal hormones, which will allow you to mobilize amino acids, glucocorticoids, and aldosterone to cause sodium and water retention, which will increase your blood volume, which is going to be needed. Also from the pituitary gland, you're going to have increased TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to increase thyroid hormones, because you're increasing not only your own basal metabolic rate, but you have the basal metabolic rate of the baby to consider as well. As well as prolactin. And of course, prolactin is going to help stimulate milk production. Increase parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. That's going to release calcium from maternal bones and make it available for the fetus. And relaxin. And that relaxin is what actually is stimulated by the HCG to help relax the sacroiliac joints as well as the symphysis pubis. All right, so body changes as a result of pregnancy. Increased size of sex organs. We've talked a little bit about that. The average weight gain is about 25 to 35 pounds, and here's the breakdown of what that weight is coming from. So it's not all fetus and it's not all amniotic fluid. Most of the volume is actually from an increase in extracellular fluid volume from that retention of sodium and retention of water. And you have an increased metabolism. As far as nutrition goes, iron is given preferentially to the fetus, which will cause the mom to end up with kind of an anemia. Increased vitamin D for the absorption of calcium, and increased vitamin K for prothrombin, because women who are pregnant are in a hypercoagulable state, which means it's easier for them to form a blood clot. And the reason for that is that if and when bleeding does occur, we can control it much more easily, and it can stop relatively quickly. All right, circulatory changes. Cardiac output by the 27th week increases by 30 to 40% because of that increased volume. That's an increase in preload. If you remember from cardiac or from the heart lecture. Of course, increase in blood volume, that's going to come with an increase in RBCs because you need to be carrying more oxygen. If you have more volume without more red blood cells, then you're going to have a lower concentration of red blood cells, hence making that anemia a little bit worse. And then you're going to have an increase in minute ventilation to help with that increase in metabolism. And also a decrease in total peripheral resistance because you want that blood to flow nice and smooth. Renal changes, of course, we know you're going to have increased sodium and water reabsorption. That contributes to the increase in extracellular fluid volume and the cardiac output, and an increase in renal blood flow and GFR to help get rid of waste much easier. And that's one of the reasons why pregnant women have to urinate all the time. Not to mention that the uterus is compressing the bladder and making it much smaller and able to hold less, so they have to go more often. All right, morning sickness occurs in most pregnancies, about 70%. My wife was sick every single day for all 9 months of her pregnancy, so much that she had to be hospitalized at one point and put on IV fluids and nutrition because she couldn't keep anything down. So although it is not an ideal situation, she had to be put on antiemetics, specifically Zofran. And typically, but she is a rare case. Usually the onset of morning sickness is about 4 to 8 weeks into gestation, so about midway through the end of the embryonic period. And then usually you see it improve by about week 14 to 16. But of course, that's going to be all across the board, and every female is going to be different. And there seems to be a genetic component because my mother-in-law, who had 6 natural children, was also sick for all 9 months. And I don't know why you'd want to have more children when you were sick for 9 months the whole time, but she did. All right, the proposed mechanism behind that is that the progesterone that is increasing is relaxing the smooth muscle of the stomach, including that lower esophageal sphincter, and making you get this nauseous feeling. All right, morning sickness tends to have a higher frequency in female fetuses, but that's only 56%, so just over half of pregnancies, so not significant. And usually associated with a more favorable outcome. So if you have somebody who has morning sickness, it's more likely that they're going to have a healthy baby. although that doesn't necessarily have to be true. All right, the amniotic sac, which contains amniotic fluid, is the fluid in which the fetus floats. Think about it. They are floating inside this sac of water in a low to no gravity environment. And then when they're born, they are thrust into an environment where they have to deal with gravity. So that's a huge change for the fetus. All right. The amniotic fluid is anywhere between half a liter to 1 liter. All right, the functions acts as a mechanical buffer, so it protects the fetus because if there's jarring around with mom, the fetus is relatively unaffected. The amniotic fluid actually provides nourishment to the fetus early in life, but as it gets bigger, of course, that's going to come more from the exchange of nutrients between the chorionic villi and the mother's blood. And it's also the mechanism by which the fetus excretes waste. The fetus is urinating because their kidneys have to do something, and they're going to be getting rid of waste, and the baby's going to pee, and so those wastes will go into the amniotic fluid, and eventually those wastes get exchanged with the mother's blood, and the mother actually gets rid of the urea, the creatinine, and things, uric acid, eventually. All right, so now we get to birth. Birth is thought to occur because of an increase in the estrogen to progesterone ratio. So you notice at some point, estrogen ends up being in higher concentrations than progesterone. And once that ratio between the two gets large enough, that's the stimulus to start the birthing process. All right, and a big hormone in the birthing process is oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so there are two parts to this. One, in order for oxytocin to have an effect, you're going to have receptors. The target for oxytocin is the uterus, so you're going to increase the amount of receptors in the smooth muscle of the uterus for oxytocin, and an increase in secretion of oxytocin to stimulate those receptors. All right. When the cervix stretches, as the baby's getting bigger and moving down to the cervix, that's going to increase the release of oxytocin. All right, so early on, the female will have Braxton Hicks contractions, which are not true contractions, but they are giving an indication that something's going to happen relatively soon. Those are about every 1 to 3 minutes. Those will eventually progress to true labor contractions, which will occur about every 1 to 3 minutes. So once you start having contractions every 1 to 3 minutes regularly, that means you're having real contractions, and it's time to, get this child out of here, give it its eviction notice. Not only is the uterus contraction, but when your OB or whoever's delivering your baby, my wife used a midwife, tells you to push, what you're doing is contracting abdominal muscles, which will help the uterus push the baby out, expulsion of the baby. So there are several stages of labor. First is where the cervix dilates, and that occurs in about 8 to 24 hours. The second stage is that the fetus is going to move down into the birth canal until it's actually delivered. That's about 1 to 30 minutes. And of course, these are just general guidelines, not specifically what happens all the time to everyone. And then after the fetus is delivered, then of course you have the delivery of the placenta, and that's going to be followed by continued uterine contractions to help expel the last bits of placenta, because if you have placental fragments that remain in the uterus, that can cause significant problems for the mom later on. And it takes about 10 to 45 minutes to deliver the placenta. And then of course, the uterus, having been stretched by the fetus, will slowly get smaller over the next 4 or 5 weeks after birth. And this is actually aided by lactation, because it turns out that as the mother's producing milk and the baby's suckling, that helps produce oxytocin, and the oxytocin producing uterine contractions helps the uterus shrink to its original size much quicker. All right, going back to those Braxton Hicks contractions, that comes from irritation of the uterine muscle from stretches. These are weak and slow contractions, and they begin about 1 month before labor. So when I said it begins relatively close to labor and giving you an indication that's going to occur soon, in about a month. Although that there's a pretty large leeway in that time frame. Um, but true contractions, true uterine contractions, will stretch the cervix and force the baby through the birthing canal. And kind of the way this works, this is a positive feedback mechanism. As the baby goes down and stretches the cervix, that sends signals to the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin, which then goes to the uterus, causes smooth muscle contractions, pushes the baby down farther, stretches the cervix more, sends signals to the hypothalamus or posterior pituitary gland, and that continues until the baby and the placenta are actually born. All right. True labor also has a circadian rhythm. Peaks are between 12 midnight and 5 a.m. And labor pains are due to ischemia of the uterine muscle because it's being stretched out so far and doing things that it's not normally used to doing. So that's going to lead to some pains. And we call those labor pains. All right, so lactation is the production of milk by the breast to feed the baby, and that's actually what breasts are supposed to be for. I had a sister-in-law that would say that she refused to breastfeed babies because breasts are for men to play with, and that was her honest belief. And the reason I mention this to you is you are going to come across patients that believe things like that, and then it's going to be your job to educate them about what breasts are for, why lactation is important, why feeding your baby, breastfeeding your baby is an important thing. So keep that in mind. You're going to hear a lot of things you never expected to hear or probably never thought you'd hear when you get into practice from some of the people that you are practicing with. So we learned before that estrogen promotes an increase in breast size, duct growth. Progesterone promotes breast lobules and alveoli, and secret helps with the ability to secrete milk. And estrogen and progesterone actually suppress prolactin secretion, and prolactin is the hormone that causes you to produce milk. So they don't stop prolactin secretion, but they slow it down enough so that when the baby's born and estrogen and progesterone levels drop, you start to secrete more prolactin, which then promotes milk secretion, and then you can actually breastfeed the child. All right, when milk comes out, the first milk is called the colostrum. And this is what colostrum looks like down here. My wife produced a lot of milk and was really good about breast pumping and saving breast milk. And for the first, I don't remember how long it occurred, but that milk was like a yellowish color, and that's the colostrum. And we called it liquid gold. So it has the same content of milk with no fat, but it's very, very nutrient rich for the baby, and will be good for it in the baby's digestive tract until it gets able to handle regular milk. So fat will slowly be introduced. And all these hormones down here listed contribute to the nutrients needed to produce milk. All right, then we have milk letdown and oxytocin. I hate that term, milk letdown. It's the secretion of milk. So we talked a little bit about this. The production of milk, the secretion of milk, is actually a merocrine secretion, where parts of cells are actually included in the fluid that comes out, and those parts of cells are where the actual nutrients come from, the fats that gets in there, the proteins that get in there from the parts of cells that are leaving. So suckling, the baby suckling on the nipple stimulates the release of oxytocin from the hypothalamus. Oxytocin goes back to the ducts around the breast, stimulates myoepithelial cells, smooth muscle cells, to contract and squirt milk out into the baby, and that will continue to happen until the baby is done feeding. And this typically occurs within 1 minute of suckling to keep a steady flow of milk coming. All right, and what this shows you is that the levels of prolactin rise until parturition, and then they fall, and then temporarily rise when suckling occurs, and then they go down, and then when suckling occurs, prolactin levels rise again to produce more milk, and then it goes down. Suckling occurs, it goes back up. So there's a cycle every time the baby feeds that you're going to be producing more prolactin, therefore producing more milk, and that makes sense because you don't want to continuously produce and have your breast become engorged, because then you can end up things like with blocked ducts and infected ducts, and that's one, very painful, and two, um, can be dangerous. And that wraps it up for the female reproductive lecture, as well as basically the birthing process and changes that occur during pregnancy and after pregnancy. So we will finish up this week by talking about blood and hemostasis, or the stoppage of bleeding.